Chapter 13, Southern Sudan, 2009. Naya thought it was funny. You had to have water to find water. Water had to be flowing constantly into the borehole to keep the drill running smoothly. The crew drove to the pond and back several times a day. The pond water was piped into what looked like a giant plastic bag, a bag big enough to fill the entire bed of the truck. The bag sprang a leak. The leak had to be patched. The patch sprang a leak. The crew patched the patch. Then the bag sprang another leak. The drilling could not go on. The drilling crew was discouraged by the leaks. They wanted to stop working, but their boss kept them going. All the workers wore the same blue coveralls. Still, Naya could tell who was the boss. He was one of the two men who had first come to the village. The other man seemed to be his main assistant. The boss would encourage the workers and laugh and joke with them. If that didn't work, he would talk to them earnestly and try to persuade them. And if that didn't work, he would get angry. He didn't get angry very often. He kept working and kept the others working too. They patched the bag again. The drilling went on. Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, 1991 to 1992. Hundreds of people lined the riverbank. The soldiers were forcing some of them into the water, prodding them with their rifle butts, shooting into the air. Other people, afraid of the soldiers and their guns, were leaping into the water on their own. They were immediately swept downstream by the powerful current. As Salva crouched on the bank and watched a young man near him plunged into the water, the current carried him swiftly downstream, but he was also making a little progress across the river. Then Salva saw the telltale flick of a crocodile's tail as it flopped into the water near the young man. Moments later, the man's head jerked oddly, once, twice. His mouth was open. Perhaps he was screaming, but Salva could not hear him over the din of the crowd and the rain. A moment later, the man was pulled under. A cloud of red stained the water. The rain was still pouring down, and now bullets were pouring down as well. The soldiers started shooting into the river, aiming their guns at the people who were trying to get across. Why? Why are they shooting at us? Salva had no choice. He jumped into the water and began to swim. A boy next to him grabbed him around the neck and clung to him tightly. Salva was forced under the surface without time to make more than a quick, shallow breath. Salva struggled, kicking, clawing. He's holding on to me too hard. I can't. Air. No air left. Suddenly, the boy's grip loosened, and Salva launched himself upward. He threw his head back and took a huge gulp of air. For a few moments, he could do nothing but gasp and choke. When his vision cleared, he saw why the boy had let go. He was floating with his head down, blood streaming from a bullet hole in the back of his neck. Stunned, Salva realized that being forced under the water had probably saved his life. But there was no time to marvel over this. More crocodiles were launching themselves off the banks. The rain, the mad current, the bullets, the crocodiles, the welter of arms and legs, the screams, the blood. He had to get across somehow. Salva did not know how long he was in the water. It felt like hours. It felt like years. When at last the tips of his toes touched mud, he forced his limbs to make swimming motions one last time. He crawled onto the riverbank and collapsed. Then he lay there in the mud, choking and sobbing for breath. Later, he would learn that at least 1,000 people had died trying to cross the river that day, drowned or shot or attacked by crocodiles. How was it that he was not one of the 1,000? Why was he one of the lucky ones? The walking began again, walking, but to where? No one knew anything for sure. Where was Salva supposed to go? Not home. There was still war everywhere in Sudan. Not back to Ethiopia. The soldiers would shoot us. Kenya. There are supposed to be refugee camps in Kenya. Salva made up his mind. He would walk south to Kenya. He did not know what he would find once he got there, but it seemed to be his best choice. Crowds of other boys followed him. Nobody talked about it, but by the end of the first day, Salva had become the leader of a group of about 1,500 boys. Some were as young as 5 years old. Those smallest boys reminded Salva of his brother Kual. But then he had an astounding thought. Kual isn't that age anymore. He is a teenager now. Salva found that he could only think of his brothers and sisters as they were when he had last seen them, not as they would be now. They were traveling through a part of Sudan still plagued by war. The fighting and bombing were worse during the day. So Salva decided that the group should hide when the sun shone and do their walking at night. But in the darkness, it was hard to be sure they were headed in the right direction. Sometimes the boys traveled for days only to realize they had gone in a huge circle. This happened so many times that Salva lost count. They met other groups of boys, all walking south. Every group had stories of terrible peril, boys who had been hurt or killed by bullets or bombs, attacked by wild animals, or left behind because they were too weak or sick to keep up. When Salva heard the stories, he thought of Marial. He felt his determination growing, as it had in the days after Uncle's death. I will get us safely to Kenya, he thought, no matter how hard it is. He organized the group, giving everybody a job, scavenge for food, collect firewood, stand guard while the group slept. Whatever food or water they found was shared equally among all of them. When the smaller boys grew too tired to walk, the older boys took turns carrying them on their backs. There were many times when some of the boys did not want to do their share of the work. Salva would talk to them, encourage them, coax, and persuade them. Once in a while, he had to speak sternly or even shout, but he tried not to do this too often. It was as if Salva's family were helping him, even though they were not there. He remembered how he had looked after his little brother Kual, but he also knew what it felt like to have to listen to the older ones. Arik and Ring, and he could recall the gentleness of his sisters, the strength of his father, the care of his mother. Most of all, he remembered how Uncle had encouraged him in the desert. One step at a time, one day at a time, just today, just this day to get through. Salva told himself this every day. He told the boys in the group too. And one day at a time, the group made its way to Kenya. More than 1,200 boys arrived safely. It took them a year and a half. Chapter 14, Southern Sudan, 2009. For 3 days, the air around Naya's home was filled with the sound of the drill. On the third afternoon, Naya joined the other children gathered around the drill site. The grown-ups rose from their work, pounding rocks, and drifted over too. The workers seemed excited. They were moving quickly as the leader called out orders. Then, whoosh! A spray of water shot high into the air. This wasn't the water that the workers had been piping into the borehole. This was new water. Water that was coming out of the hole. Everyone cheered at the sight of the water. They all laughed at the sight of the two workers who had been operating the drill. They were drenched, their clothes completely soaked through. A woman in the crowd began singing a song of celebration. Naya clapped her hands along with all the other children, but as Naya watched the water spraying out of the borehole, she frowned. The water wasn't clear. It was brown and heavy looking. It was full of mud. Ifo Refugee Camp, Kenya, 1992 to 1996. Salva was now 22 years old. For the past 5 years, he had been living in the refugee camps in northern Kenya, first at the Kakuma camp, then at Ifo. Kakuma had been a dreadful place, isolated in the middle of a dry, windy desert. Tall fences of barbed wire enclosed the camp. You weren't allowed to leave unless you were leaving for good. It felt almost like a prison. 70,000 people lived at Kakuma. Some said it was more, 80 or 90,000. There were families who had managed to escape together, but again, as in Ethiopia, most of the refugees were orphaned boys and young men. The local people who lived in the area did not like having the refugee camp nearby. They would often sneak in and steal from the refugees. Sometimes fights broke out and people were hurt or killed. After 2 years of misery at Kakuma, Salva decided to leave the camp. He had heard of another refugee camp far to the south and east where he hoped things would be better. Once again, Salva and a few other young men walked for months, but when they reached the camp at Ifo, they found that things were no different than at Kakuma. Everyone was always hungry, and there was never enough food. Many were sick or had gotten injured during their long, terrible journeys to reach the camp. The few medical volunteers could not care for everyone who needed help. Salva felt fortunate that at least he was in good health. He wanted desperately to work, to make a little money that he could use to buy extra food. He even dreamed of saving some money so that one day he could leave the camp and continue his education somehow. But there was no work. There was nothing to do but wait for the next meal, for news of the world outside the camp. The days were long and empty. They stretched into weeks, then months, then years. It was hard to keep hope alive when there was so little to feed it. Michael was an aid worker from a country called Ireland. Salva had met a lot of aid workers. They came and went, staying at the camp for several weeks, or at most, a few months. The aid workers came from many different countries, but they usually spoke English to each other. Few of the refugees spoke English, so communication with the aid workers was often difficult. But after so many years in the camp, Salva could understand a little English. He even tried to speak it once in a while, and Michael almost always seemed to understand what Salva was trying to say. One day, after the morning meal, Michael spoke to Salva. "You seem interested in learning English," he said. "How'd you like to learn to read?" The lessons began that very day. Michael wrote down 3 letters on a small scrap of paper. A, B, C, he said, handing the scrap to Salva. A, B, C, Salva repeated. The whole rest of the day, Salva went around saying A, B, C, mostly to himself, but sometimes aloud in a quiet voice. He looked at the paper 100 times and practiced drawing the letters in the dirt with a stick over and over again. Salva remembered learning to read Arabic when he was young. The Arabic alphabet had 28 letters, the English only 26. In English, the letters stayed separate from each other, so it was easy to tell them apart. In Arabic words, the letters were always joined, and a letter might look different depending on what came before or after it. Sure, you're doing lovely, Michael said the day Salva learned to write his own name. You learn fast because you work so hard. Salva did not say what he was thinking, that he was working hard because he wanted to learn to read English before Michael left the camp. Salva did not know if any of the other aid workers would take the time to teach him. But once in a while, it's good to take a break from work. Let's do something a wee bit different for a change. I'm thinking you'll be good at this. You're a tall lad. So Salva learned two things from Michael: how to read and how to play volleyball. A rumor was spreading through the camp. It began as a whisper, but soon Salva felt as if it were the roar in his ears. He could think of nothing else. America, the United States. The rumor was that about 3,000 boys and young men from the refugee camps would be chosen to go live in America. Salva could not believe it. How could it be true? How would they get there? Where would they live? Surely it was impossible. But as the days went by, the aid workers confirmed the news. It was all anyone could talk about. They only want healthy people. If you are sick, you won't be chosen. They won't take you if you have ever been a soldier with the rebels. Only orphans are being chosen. If you have any family left, you have to stay here. Weeks passed, then months. One day, a notice was posted at the camp's administration tent. It was a list of names. If your name was on the list, it meant that you had made it to the next step, the interview. After the interview, you might go to America. Salva's name was not on the list, nor was it on the next list or the one after that. Many of the boys being chosen were younger than Salva. Perhaps America doesn't want anyone too old, he thought. Each time a list was posted, Salva's heart would pound as he read the names. He tried not to lose hope. At the same time, he tried not to hope too much. Sometimes he felt he was being torn in two by the hoping and the not hoping. One windy afternoon, Michael rushed over to Salva's tent. Salva, come quickly! Your name is on the list today. Salva leapt to his feet and was running even before his friend had finished speaking. When he drew near the administration tent, he slowed down and tried to catch his breath. He might be wrong. It might be another person named Salva. I won't look too soon. Far away, I might see a name that looks like mine, and I need to be sure. Salva shouldered his way through the crowd until he was standing in front of the list. He raised his head slowly and began reading through the names. There it was, Salva Dute, Rochester, New York. Salva was going to New York. He was going to America. Chapter 15, Southern Sudan, 2009. Even though the water spraying out of the borehole was brown and muddy, some of the little boys wanted to drink right away. But their mothers had held them back. The men kept on working with the drill. Their leader talked to Naya's uncle and father and some of the other village men. Later, Depp explained things to her. Don't worry, he said. The water is muddy because it is still mixed with the old water that they were using from the pond. They have to drill farther down to make sure of getting deep enough into the good clean water underground. And then they have to put in the pipes and make a foundation with the gravel and then install the pump and pour cement around it, and the cement has to dry. It would be several more days before they could drink the water, Depp said. Naya sighed and picked up the big plastic can. Yet another walked to the pond. Nairobi, Kenya, Rochester, New York, 1996. The Lost Boys. That's what they were being called in America, the boys who had lost their homes and families because of the war and had wandered. Lost for weeks or months at a time before reaching the refugee camps. The aid worker explained this to Salva and the 8 other boys he would be traveling with. The woman spoke mostly English. Sometimes she said a word or two in Arabic, but she did not speak that language well. She tried her best to speak slowly, but she had many things to tell them, and Salva worried that he might misunderstand something important. They rode in a truck from the Ifo refugee camp to a processing center in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. Endless forms had to be filled out. Their photos were taken. There was a medical examination. It was all a blur to Salva, for he was too excited to sleep, which made him too tired to grasp everything that was happening. But there was one clear moment, when he was given new clothes. In the camp, he had worn an old pair of shorts and an even older t-shirt. He had taken as good care of them as he could, but there were holes in the shirt, and the waistband of the shorts was stretched out and threadbare. The camp workers handed out clothing whenever donations came in, but there were never enough clothes for those who needed them. Now Salva's arms were piled high with new clothes: underwear, socks, sneakers, a pair of long pants, a t-shirt, and a long-sleeve shirt to wear on top of it, and he was to wear all these clothes at the same time? It's winter in America, the aid worker said. Winter? Salva repeated. Yes, very cold. You will be given more clothes in New York. More clothes? Salva shook his head. How can I possibly wear any more clothes? Salva could hardly believe his eyes when he boarded the plane in Nairobi. Every person had a seat, and they all had luggage too. With all those people, hundreds of heavy padded chairs, and all those bags, how would the plane ever get off the ground? Somehow it did, not like a bird lifting off lightly with quick flapping of wings, but with shrieks and roars from the engines as the plane lumbered down the long runway as if it had to try as hard as it could to get into the air. Once the plane was safely aloft, Salva stared at the scene outside the small window. The world was so big, yet everything in it was so small. Huge forests and deserts became mere patches of green and brown. Cars crawled along the roads like ants in a line, and there were people down there, thousands of them, but he could not see a single one. Would you like a drink? Salva looked up at the woman in her neat uniform and shook his head to show that he did not understand. She smiled. Coca-Cola? Orange juice? Coca-Cola? Long ago, Salva's father had once brought a few bottles of Coca-Cola back from his trip to the market. Salva's first taste had been startling. All those bubbles jumping around in his mouth, what a rare treat it had been. Coca-Cola, thank you, Salva said. And with each sip, he remembered his family passing the bottles from hand to hand, laughing at the tickly bubbles, sharing and laughing together. The journey to Salva's new home required not one, not two, but 3 planes. The first plane flew from Nairobi to Frankfurt in a country called Germany. It landed with an alarming thud, then braked so hard that Salva was thrown forward in his seat. The strap across his stomach caught him hard. He took a second plane from Frankfurt to New York City. It too landed abruptly, but this time Salva was ready and he held tightly to the armrests. In New York City, the aid worker led the boys to different gates. Some would be making the final leg of their trip alone, while others were in groups of 2 or 3. Salva was the only one going to Rochester. The aid worker said that his new family would be waiting for him there. On the plane to Rochester, most of the passengers were men traveling on their own. But there were some women too, and a few families, mothers and fathers and children. Most of the people were white. Beginning at the airport in Frankfurt, Salva had seen more white people in the last few hours than he had seen before in his whole lifetime. He tried not to stare, but he couldn't help studying the families closely. Thoughts kept looping through his mind. What if my new family isn't there? What if they have changed their minds? What if they meet me and don't like me? Salva took a deep breath. A step at a time, he reminded himself, just this flight to get through, for now. The plane landed at last, its wheels screeching, while Salva gripped the armrest and braced himself for what was to come. There they were, smiling and waving in the airport lobby, his new family, Chris, the father, Louise, the mother, and 4 children. Salva would have siblings, just as he had before. He felt his shoulders relax a little on seeing their eager smiles. Salva said hello and thank you many times, for in his fatigue and confusion, these were the only words he felt sure about. He could not understand what anyone was saying, especially Louise, who spoke so quickly that at first he was not sure she was even speaking English. And yes, they did have more clothes for him. A big puffy jacket, a hat, a scarf, gloves. He put on the jacket and zipped it up. The sleeves were so bulky that he felt as if he couldn't move his arms properly. He wondered if he looked very foolish now with his body and arms so fat and his legs so thin, but none of the family laughed at him, and he soon noticed that they were all wearing the same kind of jacket. The glass doors of the airport terminal slid open. The frigid air hit Salva's face like a slap. Never had he felt such cold before. In the part of Africa where he had lived all his life, the temperature rarely dropped below 70 degrees. When he inhaled, he thought his lungs would surely freeze solid and stop working, but all around him, people were still walking and talking and moving about. Apparently, it was possible to survive in such cold temperatures, and he now understood the need for the awkward padded jacket. Salva stood still inside the terminal doors for a few moments. Leaving the airport felt like leaving his old life forever, Sudan, his village, his family. Tears came to his eyes, perhaps from the cold air blowing in through the open doors. His new family was already outside. They turned and looked back at him. Salva blinked away the tears and took his first step into a new life in America.